right, well, welcome to the Integral Stage. When I first started this channel, I'd intended to use it as a place to host some difficult discussions, some challenging discussions, the kind of conversations that in our community on the spare, flat, text-based medium of discussion forums tends to go off the rails pretty quickly. But which in video format, face-to-face or virtually face-to-face, we might hope to have a chance for a more generative or at least a more human exchange. So this might be one of those discussions. And for regular viewers of this channel, I don't think either of the guests really needs much introduction. On the left side of the ring in the blue shorts, weighing in at 225 pounds, we have Mark Forman, a longtime leader in the integral community, a psychotherapist and the author of multiple books on integral psychology, one of the co-organizers of several of the influential academic integral theory conferences. And on the right side of the ring in the red shorts, weighing in at 175 pounds, we have Brendan Graham Dempsey, host of the Metamodern Spirituality podcast, forum, and retreat, and the author of multiple books on developmental or emergentist metamodernism. And I guess I'd say what brings us together today is an interest in navigating and negotiating the boundaries between integral theory and metamodernism, or as we'll hear, maybe calling it developmental metamodernism as opposed to cultural metamodernism. And I think there'll be some attention paid to questions of lineage and attribution, things like that. But beyond that, I'll let our guests set things up. We'll have brief several-minute introductions from each, and then Mark will give a short PowerPoint presentation, and then Brendan will follow with one of those, and then we'll open it up into seeing whatever mayhem may come. So welcome, gentlemen. Good to be with you.
Thank you.
Mark, I put it in your hands.
Okay. So I think that I very much put together this PowerPoint as a consequence of some things that Nomali Pereira put together, I think probably now about 4 years ago at an integral conference in Denver, where she really raised the issue of where is integral going, what is its trajectory, and as a part of that set of questions, what is its relationship to metamodernism? And so 2 years later, when they had another conference, I took a second stab at that question of what is the relationship? And then that was partially satisfactory, but not quite what I wanted to say. I don't think I had birthed my perspective yet. And this is, I'm coming at today really more with the sort of integral person in mind, a person who has devoted some of their time to integral theory and who is coming upon the sort of new kids on the block. Not to say that metamodernism is absolutely new, but it's newer than integral, and sort of asking the question, well, what is their relationship to us? Or what do they owe us, if anything, in terms of setting some of these perspectives on their way? And so that's the implicit question is, what does metamodernism owe integral in terms of lineage? And it really is a question. I mean, it could be that after presenting what I have to say, that Graham or somebody listening could say, well, no, in fact, we don't owe integral sort of a lot of lineage or a lot of attribution, but this is my best stab so far as to why I think it would or it does. And I think it's not just a matter of saying, well, who got there first? It's also a matter of suggesting that there's an advantage in recognizing integral's contributions, particularly because of the amount of material that integral has produced, not simply Ken Wilber, but the community that has tried to address these, what I would consider metamodern problems. And to not take those up would be to lose some knowledge or a significant amount of knowledge. So it's partly critique and it's partly suggestion that as we go forward, to have these communities in a dialogue and discussion and even debate probably would serve everybody's interests.
Well, I guess I'll pick it up then. If you're
Yes, I'd pause there.
okay. Yeah, I'm looking forward to having this conversation. In a sense, right? But I think we'll be continuing to have some form of this conversation between these two communities going forward for what are probably going to be obvious reasons based on what we're going to discuss here. And yeah, I think there's a couple of strands in what's already been proposed that I would probably see as being slightly different in terms of like community versus maybe intellectual lineage and things like that. So there's some overlap, cross-pollination, and it's a very messy kind of thing. And then specifically, I'm coming here to, talk about my own work relative to this conversation and sort of Mark's critique of that work specifically. So there's a number of strands as part of this, but overall, I'm really keen to keep this, very generative. I'm open to the challenge and all that. I think that can be very productive. So not going to shy away from the challenge, but I think we can do this hopefully in a way that is productive, generative, and I don't think we'll necessarily profoundly resolve anything, but I hope that maybe we can come to some deeper understanding at least, and certainly as a prerequisite and a presumption, a position of shared mutual respect, both interpersonally, but also between these two different communities. So anyway, yeah, that's really all I have to say at the outset. I'm looking forward to where the discussion goes.
Okay, so I'm gonna assume everybody reads at a pretty good clip on this call and can always be slowed down on YouTube, but there are a lot of words and I don't want to linger too much on any one, let's say, paragraph or quote. So what is the intellectual and cultural lineage of developmental metamodernism? The developmental part is really important because that's what separates it from cultural or aesthetic metamodernism. So definitions of developmental modernism and their equivalents. Or to whom is owed attribution? So this is a question of going back in time a little bit and looking at who said what that seems like it's pointing to a metamodernism. So here's Hanzi, who's of course the sort of perhaps most well-known metamodern folks. It's a worldview which combines the modern faith in progress with postmodern critique. What you get then is a view of reality in which people are on a long, complex developmental journey towards greater complexity and existential depth. The metamodern philosophy is a whole world of ideas and suppositions that are counterintuitive to modern and postmodern people alike. But since both modern and postmodern philosophies are increasingly outdated, these metamodern ideas are set to develop, take hold, and spread. One day they may become as dominant as modern philosophy is today. So all I would ask us to notice here is that this long, complex developmental journey towards greater complexity is certainly something that an integral person or an integral influence person would say. So here we have Brendan himself. Do you go Brendan or Graham?
Brendan.
Brandon. Okay, I just want to make sure I got that right. The metamodern sensibility is thus by nature a multi-perspectival one, able to move through the various levels of reflection it contains. The metamodern can toggle between both holding modern aspirational enthusiasm 1 minute, then checking this with a more reflective awareness. So that view that one can see multiple perspectives and that you can see the levels contained within a perspective is very much integral related idea. So where and when have similar ideas been introduced? So here's Claire Graves' definition of spiral dynamics. Briefly, what I am proposing is the psychology of the mature human being is an unfolding, emerging, oscillating, which Brendan used, spiraling process marked by progressive subordination of older, lower order behavior systems to newer, higher order systems as man's existential problems change. So that's a pretty nifty definition of an integral perspective, said probably well before Wilbur would polish anything to that degree. So here's Keegan's fifth order consciousness, which in his model would be post-postmodern. He says the interior life gets freed up or broken open within oneself and with others. This new dynamism, flow, or play results from the capacity of the new self to move back and forth between psychic systems within the self. So a psychic flexibility to move and forth between psychic systems within the self. It's another way of saying to move back and forth between something like a modern and something like a postmodern self. So here's Cook-Greuter's strategist or autonomous, which is equivalent basically to metamodernism in our sort of integrals estimation. Autonomous persons realize that they may notice different conflicting aspects or polarities in themselves at different times and in different contexts, but are aware of owning and integrating many disparate parts of themselves. That's 2005. So Keegan's quote was 1995 and Graves was 1974. So a quick look at Beck and Cohen's definition of yellow, or the GT level, which is the second tier and would correspond again to what comes after the green or postmodern tier. So life is a kaleidoscope of natural hierarchies, systems, and forms. Flexibility, spontaneity, and functionality have the highest priority. Differences can be integrated into independent natural flows. So you see these sort of redundant themes of spontaneity, of flexibility, and integration. So here is finally Ken from SES. What I'm trying to do in this book, and what you are trying to do as you read it, is use vision logic, not just reasonably decide the individual issues, but hold them all together at once in mind and judge how they fit together as a truth vision. In other words, vision logic is a higher holon that operates upon and thus transcends its junior holons, such as rationality itself. As such, vision logic can hold in mind contradictions, unify opposites, it's dialectical and nonlinear, and it weaves together what would otherwise appear to be incompatible notions, as long as they relate together in the new and higher holon. So we see very much the same themes, and this is Wilbur in 1995. So these are some of the verbal similarities between metamodernism and integral. and even the visuals have some similarities, although I won't belabor this point too much. But here we see this kind of view of sort of a nested hierarchy, where in this particular version, the earlier memes are sort of nested and unfolded in the higher memes. And here's the orange, green, yellow transition that we're all very familiar with, yellow being the metamodern culture in this particular one. And then we can even look to Brendan's sort of, I don't know if you call it branding, but on the sort of cover sheet of many of his dialogues is a reverse nested hierarchy where we get blue, orange, green, yellow. So we see essentially the spiral dynamics or the integral sort of graph coding or visual representation of an idea that started with, well, at least in this one back, if it were teal at the top, it would be Wilbur. So sharing of kind of visual artifacts. So let's say, what can we say about the big picture? There's lots of hit points, bullet points about developmental metamodernism. So it's transcend and include. It's a comprehensive plurality. There's a lot about toggling, oscillation, spiraling, flow, weaving, iterating. So there's a lot about the dynamics of this process. There's a big push on complexity, multiple perspectives, paradoxes, holding contradictions, and attempting a balance and a holism. So in Wilbur's model, we get at all this through the all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, all types. Assume our listenership knows that. And then we get to Gort's claim, and obviously he is not here, so I'm not going to too deeply belabor the points. But I do think it's interesting because in Brandon's book, he uses Hanzi's version of metamodernism, or his kind of stripped down version of integral. I'm not sure how you would exactly put it, in order to sort of, I don't know, substitute for Wilbur or present a different thinker as the creator of these ideas. But basically his claim is that integral collapsed due to its incorporation of the spirituality of the world's great wisdom traditions. And I sourced it at the bottom to a YouTube video, what is metamodernism and why does it matter? But we can ask the question, did integral actually collapse? Is that claim true? We can also look at Gortz's model. So he's got cognitive complexity, which in integral speak would be sort of the leading line of development. That's how integral sees that. Then he's got depth, which is something like a catch-all, possibly for wisdom, and might serve as a proxy for the upper left development of the self or the ego. So it's very similar there. Then he's got code, which is really straightforwardly a lot like cultural value memes or SD value memes. Then he's got states, which are pretty equivalent to states. Then he's got something called the effective value meme. Your effective value meme is a kind of average between your complexity, code state and depth. So what I'm trying to point out here is that Gortz's sort of heuristic model is very similar to integral and has pretty clear correspondences. And it's not deadly obvious to me why it's an improvement, other than perhaps that the model of hierarchical complexity doesn't really have a spiritual component, and so it problematizes Wilbur's spiritual line of development that he puts out. And not to toot my own horn, but I wrote that in 2010 in my book on integral psychotherapy, that I thought this was a problem, that he was stacking Aurobindo's stages onto other stages with less evidence. Okay, we can pretty much skip this. This is just Elke Fine, who's an integralist, suggesting that it's frustrating to see Gortz reduce all of the developmental claims of integral to the model of hierarchical complexity, and sort of claiming that people like Robert Keegan, Jane Lovinger, Susan Cook-Reuter are just mixed up or blend issues of personality into different stages and splice it up with psychiatric diagnoses, where lower stages are described as psychopaths, more or less. I mean, that is an incredibly dismissive, I would say, almost, I mean, it's dismissive to the point of insulting. I mean, Keegan did write a paper on early development and psychopathology, but it was a serious paper. It wasn't a throwaway line. It was a real argument. And if you look into the literature about ego development and psychopathology, or psychopaths to be more specific, you will see a connection that people at lower levels of development, particularly if they're a bit older, often have what they call externalizing psychopathology. That means psychopathology that they take out on others. So they begin to appear antisocial or psychopathic, and it's actually been studied. So let's look a little bit at this question. This is a new arc and hopefully not too long, what the impact of Wilbur has been. So versus the Hansi claim that he's collapsed. So Wilbur's still publishing, likely as a leading seller in the genre. I don't know. I asked Corey DeVos if he had a number on what Wilbur still sells. He didn't. But there are about 53 books written about integral applications in different domains, and only one of these was co-authored by Wilbur. I am sure there are in the dozens or hundreds, low hundreds, dissertations and papers that have been written. The most popular book applying integral is Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. And at this point, it has 1,913 ratings, between 4.6 out of 5 on Amazon. So if you know your Amazon, you know getting 1,900 ratings is a sign of some pretty major success, especially for a book on organizational development. So integral in this measure is not dying, not collapsed. Then there are the YouTube videos. There's Meet the Einstein of Consciousness and Spiritual Awakening at 1.3 million views. There's a 4-quadrant video at 1.1 million views. And then there's the oh-so famous Ken Stops His Brainwaves at 433 thousand views. As far as I could find, the highest viewed video, Nothing to Shake a Stick At, is 143,000 views on Metamodernism by Hansi, posted 2 years ago. So Metamodernism is also getting clicks. However, the winner appears to be this fellow who writes on a lot of male-female issues, but he did one on levels of thinking, which is a really straightforward application of Cook-Greuter and integral, and it's at 3.2 million views, and it's only 10 months old, so late 2023. So it's very recent, and this just suggests that for integral, for all its whatever it hasn't done, is still garnering attention, and I think that matters because it's not, let's say, dead paper at this point. It's moving into social media. So I'm not going to read this out, but this is a list, I think, that Bruce compiled of 45 known universities or colleges that utilize integral theory. So we can see the more prestigious ones: Michigan, Virginia, Stanford, Northwestern, Hopkins, UNC Chapel Hill, University of Colorado, etc. So it is being taken up by academicians, and this has been a charge I've heard that I won't attribute to anybody because I can't remember who said it, but people have just said, well, integral is not taken seriously anywhere in the academy, hence the need to replace it. And I would say that might be a short-sighted view, and that it is making inroads as we go, even if a bit slowly. So the summation of the argument, and I appreciate everybody's patience on this PowerPoint. So I would argue metamodernism appears to be trying to obfuscate integral and garner intellectual space without proper or accurate attribution of its lineage. And some of its critiques, which are meant to distance, are on shaky or simplistic ground. And I'm thinking there of Hansi's dismissals of all the other developmental lineages. I would also say many integrals are Gen Xers and are just now coming into their prime as leaders, especially as the boomers outlive previous generations, but are now fading. So the next 15 to 20 years will be telling as Gen X moves into the hierarchies, let's say, of different domains. And it would be a shame and a huge loss of collective knowledge, practical and theoretical, to abandon the corpus of the integral community because some have aspects of it haven't worked or have made people uncomfortable. And there are those aspects, and we have done videos with Bruce on this channel, and including with Nomali, to cover some of these disappointments and talk them through. There's also just a scholarly question, how much attribution is just owed due to the scholarly code of conduct, let's say. How much do you presence the pioneers of a particular line of thought, even if it's only to later disagree with them? It doesn't mean you have to accept them. It only means you are pointing to some of the roots of the tree. So what do we do? It would be best if there were a continued and substantive discussion between metamoderns and integrals. Some of this should be constructive, critical, and some should be domain specific and not just theory specific. It would be interesting to hear what a metamodern psychotherapy is versus an integral psychotherapy. And I expect that these things will start to come down the line. And that maybe integral should consider an explicit rebranding of teal integral, which is very, very close to metamodernism, versus perhaps a turquoise integral, which is not deeply covered, at least in the metamodern materials I've been exposed to. And this would be more of a construct aware integral. And that's a whole other can of worms. Okay, I'm going to stop my share and I pass the ball to Brandon, unless someone wants to comment on what I just presented before and then move to Brandon. We either way would be fine with me.
Cool. So I'll pick it up from here then. So that was helpful in the sense that I think it clarifies some of the scope and the frame that I think we are actually in danger of talking past each other on. So I think it's really helpful that we can get a lay of the land of what it is that we're actually identifying and what we're actually trying to speak to. This will come out in what I'm about to share, but I'll kind of foreground it now because I think it's the main takeaway based on your presentation, which is that what you are calling developmental metamodernism, I'm reading as basically just Hansi Freinach's work. And so I think that might be the scope or the source of a lot of confusion here. So again, what I'm about to present will unpack that a lot. Up front, I'll just say there's no contestation that Hansi Freinach's metamodernism is deeply integral informed, deeply drawing from that tradition, trying to modify it in meaningful ways, but no question that it is explicitly working within an integral and spiral dynamics framework. It does mention both of those, and it does try to critique and kind of integrate those as well. But as I'll get into here in a second, that's just a subset of the metamodern discourse that I'm trying to map in my book. And so what I'm referring to as metamodernism is a broader category. And so I'll unpack that in a second. The only thing I guess I would add to that, no, I guess I'll just I'll dive in. So I'll share my screen. All right. Are you looking at my slides now?
Yes, if your
Okay.
slides of my Amazon review.
Yeah, I was going to start here because I think it's a great place to unpack some of the misunderstandings that I think are our chief hangups. So this was sort of your review on record for the Metamodernism book that I wrote. And I'll just focus on a couple aspects of it because, again, I think they get to the core of the confusion here. So you gave it 2 stars and you said, this book intends to give a nominal description of how the notion of metamodernism came to be. And in this regard, the book is an utter and unforgivable failure. Barring what is referred to here as aesthetic metamodernism, the notion of metamodernism as is widely discussed is almost completely owed to 2 theorists, Ken Wilber and Don Beck. And then later, to relegate Wilber to just one solitary footnote on page 199 and to completely fail to mention Beck or his main influence, Clare Graves, is an intellectual omission of the worst possible kind and must have been motivated. It is like discussing Darwinism without Darwin or linguistics without Chomsky, especially when the author spends a great deal of space discussing the pseudonymous work of Hansi Freinach, whose writings are a far lesser light, inescapably derivative of Wilbur's and Beck's. So I think this kind of encapsulates the source of confusion here, because I think that if you believe that, then I'm not sure if we're talking about the same thing. And so what I mean by that is the book that I wrote, Metamodernism or the Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics, which that was your review of, very explicitly aims to do a particular thing. It's trying to understand what the commonalities are to this sort of discourse that has emerged in the early 2000s, referring to metamodernism. And there are particular works in which this was kind of seminally raised by mostly by scholars. There's a kind of piece written in 2007 by Alexander Dumitrescu, but the discourse really gets kicked off with Tim Vermeulen and Robin Bondenacker in a 2010 essay that they wrote, which then in 2017 they published an anthology working with various scholars who basically try to work within that framework that they've developed, and that's that picture, that anthology here. Then there is the Hansi Freinacht work of 2017, which uses the term metamodernism, draws on the work of Vermeulen and Bondenacker, but brings in a whole kind of integrally informed developmental conception that that draws from the integral background that they share as authors. Then there's the 2019 work, Metamodernity, and the 2021 work, Metamodernism by Jason Storm. So what my book was trying to do, and it says this very explicitly at the beginning, is it tries to track like all these things use the same term, metamodern, metamodernism. Is that just chance? Is that coincidence? Are they actually even talking about the same thing in any meaningful way? Or, as some people were suggesting, no, they're actually very different. And so folks like Greg Dember and other folks, well, mainly Greg most vociferously, were very adamant that that everything Hansi was doing bared no correlation or connection in any way to the work of Vermeulen and von Donacker. Even within the cultural studies sphere, there was some tension between von Donacker and Tim Vermeulen and Dumitrescu's work. And then, of course, you get something like Storm coming out and writing his systematic philosophy and making nods to these authors, including Hansi's work, but also doing his own thing, etc. And so there was a contestation that that there might be some sort of superficial similarities here in the use of this term, but that deeper connections were basically non-existent. And so I wrote the book as an attempt to synthesize these and to try to show that there is a deep structural element that kind of unites these all in a deeper way. And when we see that, we can actually recognize that all of these people talking about metamodernism are talking about a deeper structure. There might be different superficial levels of focus, different kinds of theoretical divergences, and what kinds of frameworks and things and models people are leaning on. But ultimately, I was trying to make the point that there's a there to this whole metamodern thing, and despite the diversity, there's an underlying unity. So based on Mark's review, though, there's this suggestion that the real kind of, if you wanted to trace the intellectual history of metamodernism, you have to reference Ken Wilber and Don Beck. And so is that true? Well, if you look at this discourse space, whose synthesis was my main objective in my book, no. Basically, none of these works that have the X's on them reference, cite, engage with in any way the work of Wilber or Don Beck or Clare Graves or any of that. Mark brought up the word oscillation in Clare Graves' work, and that has zero connection to the oscillation talked about by Vermeulen and von Donacker. So there's absolutely no connection to any of that lineage in these particular works. The glaring exception is the Listening Society, the Metamodern book by Hansi Freinacht, which does represent an integrally informed sort of interpretation of metamodernism, but also meaningfully draws very important kinds of distinctions by trying to not just say, hey, look, all these metamodern things are actually just integral. It's actually trying to say, actually, we also have a problem with how integral has been framed historically, and we're trying to basically bring together these ideas about metamodernism with the kind of developmental insights that you did see in integral theory, but we're also trying to upgrade integral theory and critique integral theory and critique spiral dynamics. So even in this case, it's not like, yes, this is just integral theory. You have a kind of partial overlap, and a very meaningful and significant one. So a lot of what you were getting at, Mark, in your presentation, I wouldn't contest in any way. I think that more or less explicitly, the Hansi works that kind of position themselves as yellow staged spiral dynamic sphere and teal integral and that sort of a thing. But there is also that meaningful, self-differentiation that it's like they're not just trying to do integral, they're using an integrally informed kind of developmental cultural evolutionary framework, and they're trying to position this metamodern thing in light of that, but they're also making meaningful distinctions and differences, including a critique of turquoise and those other models. So This is where the deep connection with integral theory does enter the metamodern discourse space, but not entirely, right? And so there's just a couple of quotes here. There's many more in the book in which actually the authors very explicitly say we draw on Wilbur, but we don't really want to be particularly connected to his work, and they have some pretty choice words about spiral dynamics even. So anyway, be all that as it may, that I think is really the source of this issue. And so what I'm trying to do is not just talk about Hansi Freinach's developmental metamodernism, if that's what we want to call it. I'm interested in the structural, systemic, deep similarities that obtain across these different metamodern discourse forms, and trying to find what's this underlying, their shared object of analysis or something like that, right? And so the way that I try to do that in my book is by leaning into the prefix meta, right? Why is it metamodernism? And so I think that if we interpret what is common to these different frameworks through this light, we can actually find some deep congruities here that are very revealing, right? And so this does start to bring in ideas that obviously we find deep connections with in, I'll talk about this more in a second, but Hegelian dialectics and complexity theory and developmental theory, and that sort of set of ideas, where you get a process in which something basically decenters from its vantage and then steps outside of that vantage and can reflect on the vantage that it had from a new perspective, essentially. And that if you interpret what these various forms of metamodernism are doing, this seems to be a good way of thinking about how they're engaging with modernism, postmodernism, and then doing something beyond that. And so the idea is that you get this kind of nested, recursive kind of reduplication of a thing when something goes meta. So metacognition is, the mind thinking about the mind, and meta, language is language about language, this sort of thing. So this is just the basic kind of conceptual architecture that if we wanted to view metamodernism through, what do we get from that? And so like this image, for example, is if you just look up Hegelian dialectics, right? This is like literally the first image that comes up in a Google search. And so this is from Stanford, Encyclopedia of Philosophy or whatever. But this is what if an integral person would see this, they'd be, oh, that's a holarchy, that's a nested concentric circles of increasing embrace and all this stuff, right? It was like, well, yeah, it is, and that is not an accident, because Wilbur himself was drawing on deeper kind of dialectical structures in framing his whole meta-theoretical project. So it's not an accident that these kinds of structures appear, but they're not owned by integral theory per se, right? They're helpful kind of heuristic tools we can use to understand deeper processes. And these go all the way back to, again, Hegel and the Romantics and whatnot. So anyway, when I did this analysis on these particular sets of texts, I found that this was essentially what they were all doing in common. There was all some kind of a dialectical synthesis that they were explicitly speaking to, where, so the Dumitrescu piece explicitly identifies metamodernism as the synthesis between the thesis and antithesis of modernism and postmodernism. There's a wonderful piece in the anthology of Tim Vermeulen and Robin von Donecker and Alison Gibbons that talks about the metamodern dynamics that they're seeing as being a negation of a negation. That language is, explicitly Hegelian. Jason Storm uses the exact same language. Hansi himself talks about real dialectique. And the notion that integration is some kind of way in which we can get a both and, we can kind of accrete and grow from what was before without having to negate, or if we do negate, then we negate the negation as well. And this is just a deep pattern that all of these meta-modernisms were employing to make sense of the relationship between modernism and postmodernism and what was supposedly metamodern. And again, these kinds of patterns, whether they're spiral dynamic patterns, what have you, right? These are not owned by integral theory. They're not owned by spiral dynamics. These are dialectical processes that have been long described in those terms, right? I'm glad you did bring up Keegan, because it's a great example. This is Robert Keegan's book on the evolving self, where this is described as a going meta process, right? And as you go meta, you decenter, and then you get a higher vantage, and then there's this sort of recursive dialectical movement that goes on, which he describes here with recourse to Piaget. But again, this is another example, right? This process has been called a number of things by many different people. He names Piaget, Schachtel, Elkind, Perry, his own work, obviously. And of course, we see this not just in developmental psychology, we see it as a broader kind of structural pattern in the world, which is why dialectical thinking is so powerful, because it's not limited to one particular domain. It's sort of it is a processual logic that is inherently a vision logic. So, a meta move is going to look something like this. This is, again, kind of Keegan's framework for thinking about this stuff. And so what am I getting at here? I'm just saying that I think we might be talking past each other a little bit. If we want to have a conversation around, is Hansi Freinacht's books, or is the work of Hansi Freinacht derivative of spiral dynamics and integral theory in a way that it doesn't give due credit to those sources? I'm very happy to have that conversation. I just think it's kind of a different one if we're trying to say that metamodernism as a broad label in discourse is somehow inherently indebted to Wilber and Dombeck specifically, because I don't think that's really the case. And again, if you look at the majority of sources upon which the metamodern discourse is drawing, the majority of them don't even have any kind of integral framing to them. In fact, as I was writing that book, there were people very loudly saying, we don't want to have anything to do with integral theory. Though, of course, Lena Rachel Anderson has gone on to actually explicitly change the name of her work to polymodernity because she was so adamant that it not be related to metamodernism because it was being increasingly linked to integral theory. There was also, the cultural studies folks who were likewise getting very frustrated by this conflation of metamodernism with integral theory. And so what I'm suggesting is that I think that there's a lot of confusion out there about what people think metamodernism is, where it comes from, and hence why you would say what you did in your review and thus be very unhappy about a book that wasn't actually trying to do what you thought it was trying to do. So that does raise legitimate questions, right? Like, what are the basis of the similarities then, such as they are in the kind of metamodernism that I'm synthesizing from all of this and integral theory? Because there are similarities, right? Like, I talk about decentration, talk about recursive reflection, and, of course, Wilber doesn't use those terms a lot, but there's a dialectical logic clearly in Wilber's work that we get with transcend and include, which, of course, even for him, that goes back to Whitehead and all that. My point is, there's a deep dialectical tradition that Wilber himself is part of, but I guess even if you take out the fact that, the whole line of argumentation, which would be that Wilber himself is, I don't want to say derivative, because Wilber is a very pioneering thinker, but Wilber's drawing on earlier frameworks and models and ways of thinking that are very clearly a synthetic account himself, right? So notions of synthesis and integration and this sort of a thing themselves don't kind of go back to Wilber per se. Even the developmental psychologists drawing on these kinds of frameworks are drawing on deeper structures. And so anyway, all that being said, why might there be some similarities that do persist in even a synthetic account of the diverse materials that we find in the kind of metamodern discourse space, from Storm to Dumitrescu to Vermeulen and everyone else? Well, because one, it includes the work of Hansi Freinacht. So the book I wrote includes Hansi's work in it. And so I'm trying to make a synthetic analysis of all these metamodernisms. And if Hansi is deeply based in developmental integral thought, then any kind of synthesis that includes Hansi Freinacht's work is going to have that as a part of it. So I think that we should just acknowledge that. We should also, though, acknowledge that, again, to go back to that review, is sort of like, well, the problem that the quote unquote problem that I spent so much time talking about Hansi's work and not Wilber's is not a problem. I'm trying to integrate and synthesize metamodern thinkers, and there is not any metamodern usage by Wilber or anyone else, right? I'm explicitly trying to synthesize metamodernists. So I think that, again, if people just think that I think people might just have a different understanding of what that particular project is. But I want to acknowledge that because Hansi Freinach's in there and because he's deeply integrally informed, then any kind of broader synthesis project is going to have those elements that are going to be constitutive of them. And that makes sense. Another aspect is kind of what I was just getting at a minute ago, which is that Wilbur himself is drawing on deeper intellectual currents, including Hegelian dialectics, reconstructed dialectical materialism. Obviously, he quotes a lot and draws a lot from Habermas, who himself was basically drawing on Marx, who was drawing on Hegel. So there's this deep intellectual lineage there, but also early system thinkers, etc. So to the degree that this kind of analysis is employing those kinds of frameworks as well, then of course there's going to be deep structural similarities. But most importantly, I think that it's significant that we're mapping the same territory, essentially, right? Meaning, like, what Wilbur's trying to do, in part, of course, because it's very expansive, but in part what he's trying to do is intimate or articulate a post-postmodernism that is progressive, that moves beyond postmodernism. But if it's going to be genuinely progressive and kind of dialectical in nature, then it needs to somehow also include aspects of postmodernism. And anytime anything does that in any way, it's going to take this kind of shape. And so that, I think, is an aspect to this. It's also greatly to Wilbur's credit, which is that in trying to articulate what a postmodernism that's progressive, what it would look like, yeah, there's a lot of overlap in what it has come to indeed look like, which is framed very deeply and philosophically in Jason Storm's work, and captured in the aesthetic currents of kind of the cultural studies thing. And so I think, especially in the sense of giving people their due, that people, integral folks should be like, yeah, like, well, Wilbur was clearly onto something, and writing in 95, look, in the 25 years that have followed, that indeed, became more and more the kind of, forces and sentiments and proclivities and orientations that came to dominate postmodernism. So in trying to then synthesize what metamodern thinkers who are basically doing the same thing in various ways, of course, there's going to be structural overlap in all of that. And so, again, in my book, the kind of metamodernism that I'm talking about is that Hansi's is one form, and it's just part of the mix, but it's not the whole form. I'm trying to do something broader. And I think if we're just trying to debate Hansi metamodernism versus integral, yeah, we can talk about that. And maybe we'll actually find a lot of common ground on that front, because I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of maybe what people are frustrated by on that. There's some of that material that could be gotten into. Some of Hansi's critiques I deeply resonate with in terms of some of the shortcomings of earlier developmental models, and some of the shortcomings of Wilbur's models that new data and new studies have revealed. So it is, I think, genuinely trying to move that ball forward. But what I'm trying to do isn't just in that domain. It's trying to rather synthesize all of these metamodernisms into a deeper structure. And so, yeah, I just think that then if we can recognize that that is actually what is going on here, then to say that giving the description of how the notion of metamodernism came to be, yes, that does not need to include a great deal of time spent or pages spilt or ink spilt rather on Ken Wilber and Don Beck, because that's just not the majority of what that tradition is about. So hopefully that explains that a bit. And if that wasn't clear, then maybe that's a fault of mine in terms of how I wrote the book. But I did try to be very explicit about that from the get-go. So that's my little PowerPoint presentation. Happy to dive into wherever we want to go with that. I'm happy to talk more about my concepts of metamodernism and what I feel like this paradigm is doing, but I'm also happy to pivot more into addressing the specific substantive issues you might have with Hansi Freinach's books and that sort of a thing. So I'm very open to wherever we go with that. But first, maybe I'd just be curious if any of that was genuinely clarifying or whatnot, or yeah. So anyway, that's what I got to offer.
I would say that it's clarifying, and it sort of highlights an issue which is mystifying is too dramatic a word, but perhaps confusing. So if I'm an alien and I'm landing on Earth, and I'm being asked the question by the alien, what is this metamodern stuff? And oh, by the way, how much space does it take up in your discourse? here down on Earth, and maybe in your American, European discourse in particular. Could you visually represent that to me, the alien? And so if we, would construct an image that would somewhat sort of highlight the size of the discourse as a circle, and then another discourse as a circle, and we would try to get the relative circles to represent the amount of attention. So it's really, really difficult for me to imagine a mapping of that sort in which integral is not a far larger circle. And then if you include its dance with spiral, that spiral integral dance, like we see applied in a reinventing organizations, that is just a much bigger piece of land. And in my training, on how to do academic attribution, it was really, you look at the subject and you try to identify the people most responsible or most connected, even if it's tangential in some cases, to an idea, so that you're saying, well, the psychodynamic stuff originates with Freud, and then the Neo-Freudians and Heinz and Kohut, and those names are not so important other than the fact that they built off of Freud, let's say. And so we're drawing a line and helping the reader make it through that. It's really hard to wrap my brain around the idea that we would come to a metamodernism that has emergent or developmental perspectives and not see Wilbur as an almost inescapable thing to mention. Now, you did mention things like Hegel and stuff, but for most of his career, Wilbur was very good about citing where things were coming from, even if he was to disagree with him. He spoke very glowingly of Joseph Campbell, for example, and then he gives a pretty sharp critique of it. But sort of that kind of way of scholarly attribution is what I cut my teeth on. So now just to finish that thought, now you may say, well, geez, these versions of metamodernism have just nothing to do with integral. I don't know that to be the case because I'd have to read everybody's bibliography. But it would be, even if I were writing a book about those metamodernisms, it would be strange to not include what has been the largest, most populated form of metamodernism, even as an aside or a chapter or something, to say, hey, there's this other thing on the block. So I think it's something about you're trying to write something that I see as almost inescapably connected to integral or in the same genre. I'll just give one more example. Sabina Hassenfelder, who's a physics critiquer and a physicist herself, was talking about Stephen Wolfram's ideas on the unified theory of the world. And, she just sort of gently glided into, well, the work that he's doing now is very similar to the work being done by XYZ researcher, and that's super interesting. But that kind of connection, that's the scholarly connection as I see it, is that you go there almost as a matter of course not as a matter of maybe splitting the hairs to say, okay, this isn't quite in that camp. So I think that attribution question is really ripe for me. And
Well,
hopefully that was clear.
yeah, it was. I have a lot of thoughts, but maybe the best way into that is, and I don't want to put you on the spot, and I don't want this to feel like it's that I don't want it to feel like that. So we don't have to do this, if it feels like I'm putting you on the spot. But have you read Jason Storm's book, for example, Metamodernism: The Future of Theory?
No, I have not.
Have you read Alexander Dumitrescu's Interconnections in Blakean Space, her Metamodern 2007 article? Have you read the 2010 Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin von Doniker seminal article, Notes on Metamodernism?
I may have skimmed it, but I don't think so.
Okay.
I've read a lot about Hansi's book. I've read Linda Cirilio. I've read Greg Dember and conversed with him. I've watched multiple YouTube videos in which these folks are being interviewed, and so.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to get. I think that I think the issue is that for you and for a lot of people, their awareness of metamodernism came through Integral. That was a big because the Hansi Freinacht folks came through an Integral community and then were doing their thing, and then they tried to basically extend and critique Wilbur in their new thing, and they called it metamodernism, etc. It's undeniably the case that many people in, let's say, the online space in particular are aware of metamodernism as that, right? Now, so, and I think it sounds like for you, that's the predominant form of metamodernism that you have in mind. Now, a couple things about that. One is, that wasn't my experience, right? I came from the cultural studies side of things. In 2014, in 2013, I found that 2010 article. I read it. I submitted an article to do a presentation at the University of Strathclyde in 2014. I met Tim and Robin and did this whole thing. And then for the next number of years, made a website on basically metamodern art and all this stuff. And it was only then in around 2018 that I discovered Hansi's work. And I was like, oh, this is weird. It's like, really engaging with the sincere irony bit that I'm familiar with, but it's also bringing in all these things that are different and new, and this is kind of odd and exciting. And so I think that, one, just autobiographically, I have kind of a different vantage on it, but two, I think that that's why I kind of wanted to write this book for some reasons, is because there are people like Dember and Linda Cirillo and folks in the cultural studies camp who, again, are screaming very loudly, we don't see a connection here. There isn't actually like much of it. We never cite Wilbur. There is no Wilbur stuff here. And in fact, a lot of that contingent of the discourse is very angry that there has been this online scene that has this integral connection, and they're frustrated by that. And then conversely, I already named this in my presentation, right? I don't know if you've read Lena Rachel Anderson's, her book originally called Metamodernity, but the point is, I think that there's a little bit of a bias that enters in for people who are coming to metamodernism and equating metamodernism with Hansi Freinacht. One of the big reasons I wrote the book was to say, nope, Hansi Freinacht has been a really important strand of metamodern conversation, but there's tensions and differences and different lineages. Now, to bring it back to what you were saying a minute ago, because I take it very seriously, right? Like I didn't follow ultimately into academia, but I'm a researcher and I'm a writer, and so I take very seriously academic writing. I'm very keen to cite things. I understand the norms around that, and I take very seriously what I hear to be a kind of call into questioning of my integrity as a sort of academic, as a scholar, as a researcher, by not properly citing sources and all this stuff. And so I take that seriously. And if I felt like as you said, this was this motivated thing. I was trying to like, oh no, we got to steal Wilbur's ideas and then present them as our own and then hide him over here. Then yeah, that would be really sketchy. But I think if people actually understood the broader context of what metamodernism is and what it has been, I think that they'd understand that actually Ken Wilber and integral theory represent just an influence on one strand of that discourse. And so I would take issue, I would contest your notion that necessarily a book of my nature must include some kind of chapter or something on integral theory, because it's like, well, that's not what this book is trying to do. And for one last further clarification, I also wasn't trying to write a pure intellectual history, right? In the sense of, if one were to try to do what you're describing, which is, okay, psychotherapy goes back to Freud and this goes back to this, that can be done. And I think it'd be fascinating. But what I was trying to do was basically just look at the instances of metamodern books that have been written and look for deep structural similarities and continuities. If I wanted to do intellectual history of being like, okay, well, where did this person get this idea and where did this person get this idea? Then you could do some kind of interesting archaeology. And obviously, Wilber would be a core and essential aspect. And the same with Beck and Claire Graves and a lot of the developmental literature for Hansi Freinacht. You wouldn't see that in the other developmental metamodernists, but interestingly, what you would see is that, oh, okay, well, also Wilber's drawing on Habermas, who's doing this reconstructive dialectical materialism that's drawing on Piaget and all that, and then that goes back to Marx, and then that goes back to Hegel, and then look, what the Tim Vermeulen and Robin von Donneker people, what they're doing is drawing on Raymond Williams and Frederick Jameson, Marxist scholars who also are kind of dialectical materialists, so there's a deep connection there, and so on and so forth. Now, I guess I'm just saying one could do that. It's just not what this book was doing. And so I just, in trying to kind of, not, I think, unjustly fall prey to a particular kind of critique that I feel like is based in a misunderstanding. I feel like it's important to clarify that. All right, I'll.
Well, what I would say is, if at the end of the process that you described that you wanted to do, the conclusion or summary overviews of what the worldview were became radically different than Wilber's integral or spiral, etc., I would say, oh, okay, what you've done is taken a very different body of literature, not only different in nature, but different in self-attribution. In other words, the authors are attributing their radically different world space, and seeing Wilber as completely other. I would say, okay. But then what I see as I was looking for definitions of metamodernism are paragraphs that could literally be ripped out of a Wilber book, paged in, and no one would know, except maybe one word here or there. I took down one, by Luke Turner, who I understand is one of the earlier writers in metamodernism, and there was nothing wrong with the quote, except that it sounded almost exactly like integral.
But he had no connection with integral. Like Luke Turner has zero, like he probably doesn't even know who Ken Wilber is. There's zero connection with that and integral. So I think, anyway, I'll just say that. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
But here's the scholarly thing. Even if you discover something in a way that is completely different than something that already exists writ large, capital W, it is incumbent upon you to note that this has been in existence for at least 15 years before you wrote your summary of what metamodernism is. You can't just come up and say, well, we discovered cold fusion and we didn't use any of the same techniques as Bob and Jane cold fusion paper in Nature. You would, by the sort of scholarly code, have to say there's this other group that discovered cold fusion 15 years earlier, using a different method, and then you would be in an interesting scholarly and important scholarly debate about what are the advantages and disadvantages of each. You don't get the luxury of saying, well, we came up with this independently, therefore we're going to ignore what has been around and just treat it like it hadn't happened. And that was what I came away, unfortunately, from your book. That was the taste, was you were saying a lot of good things. You were just doing a nice job describing what I would understand metamodernism to be. But it's as if you did it in a vacuum without recognizing someone had beat you to the punch. Depending on when your book was, I think it was 2024, that's 30 years earlier that Wilbur is writing things that are extremely similar, if not exactly similar. And I guess that may be the rub of it. I'd be curious to hear what Bruce has to say, just to break up our back and forth a little bit, because, we're all scholarly trained. I believe all of us have PhDs. So it's an interesting argument, or a master's at least, what do you owe a pre-existing work, even if it's in a different intellectual line, but is covering the same ground? Are they owed attribution? Is that a moot question for some reason?
Well, before Bruce chimes in, I do just want to directly respond briefly to that, if I can. One is just, there's a degree here to which I do think we're still speaking past each other, because, again, like, I'm not trying to say, oh, look what I came up with, or look, I'm beating someone to the punch, or I discovered something. I'm just trying to say, here's a bunch of people talking about metamodernism. Are they the same? Are they different? And then if they are similar, how are they similar? And here's my conclusion. Now, to your point, though, and in good faith, right? Like, I'm trying to think of what could be done that would make sense to alter the book in its current form, such that it gives the kind of due attribution that you would desire, that you would find appropriate. And the only thing I can come up with is maybe in the final chapter, when I say, I see this as a worldview and here's why, ... Maybe there's a footnote there that says something like, and when we see it this way, a lot of this is prefigured in the works of Wilbur in a meaningful way, and maybe there's a quote or two or something like that. There already is a quote in the Hansi Freinacht chapter citing Wilbur, but maybe, that's not enough. So I'm trying to think of what would actually make sense, like academically speaking, of once you've done the argument of, hey, there's a deep similarity here and it looks like this, and then what? And then you say, and when we look at it like this, it looks a lot like integral theory, but it's like, well, yeah, because of course it does, because to some degree it's based on that, given its reference to Hansi Freinacht's work, which is deeply, but we've already established that. So I just don't know exactly what the thing to do that would be changing this, that would actually find,
It would be setting context. And if I were your imagined editor, I would say to you, okay, you're writing this book on metamodernism. I would say that in the foreword, you would want to say that there are synonyms for metamodernism that are out there and that are being proposed and have been proposed. So post-postmodernism is the same thing as metamodernism, at least in its most basic linguistic meaning. And so I would say we are going to look at a certain segment of the metamodern literature, understanding that there are other groups, writers, communities, which would claim some ownership of that discourse, and that might include Wilbur or Beck or whatever, and we're not dealing with their version of metamodernism. We're dealing with this other version, but we're recognizing that in the meta context, there are these different camps, for whatever, maybe there's a better word than camps. And so, as you, as the reader, I want you to know we're taking you down path A and all of the authors that you were mentioning. And there's a path B or C or maybe more that we're not taking you down.
I just
And
want to say to that point, though, that if I were to do that, right, I would also have to talk about digimodernism and hypermodernism and altermodernism. There's a number of post or non, postmodernisms that would need to then, and like, again, it's sort of like at that point, it becomes a very different book, because then it's like a survey of all the different kinds of things adjacent to or beyond postmodernism, because it's also, integral is not a synonym for metamodernism. And one of the other aspects of this too is that there are, like, even from what I'm trying to get at in terms of the way I'm using the term metamodernism, yeah, there's some structural aspects there that are dialectical, that are developmental, you could say. But in terms of just saying, and that's what integral theory is, it's like, well, no, because there's this whole infrastructure of integral theory that includes states and meditation and subtle realms and, indigo consciousness and stuff. And it's like, no, that's not a part of this really at all. It's not to say, it's just not to make it's just not to go there really. So some meaningful distinction needs to be kind of clear there. That's why it's sort of like, okay, if we're going to talk about Hansi Freinach's metamodernism, and that's this kind of integrally informed critique of integral that does a different thing, but is still very integral and developmental in nature, well, then, yeah, we can use that as a basis point to seeing the developmental aspect of metamodernism, but trying to just equate that with integral then is like, there's a whole reason why metamodernism in Hansi's thing did what it did, because it was trying to differentiate itself from integral. So then to write a book on metamodernisms and say, by the way, this is integral, or at least that this is a synonym, or I don't know. But
I would say
yeah.
you could very easily punch it out in a couple of sentences, which would say something like, there are people who claim to be working on the same type of terrain.
Okay.
Wilbur, 1995, etc. And a review of their work is beyond the scope of this text.
I love that. I love that.
My favorite line from my PhD days, which just means I'm pointing you to these other people who would claim to own or have first come up with these ideas. We're not dealing with it. We're actually clarifyingly dealing with a different lineage.
Okay.
And that sort of short pivot,
yeah,
gets you a lot of distance, and also situates the reader for like, oh, okay, we're going down a different, and absolutely, because I cut my teeth on integral, and I cut my teeth on SD and integral in terms of what post-postmodernism might be. Have a head of steam towards any book on metamodernism, thinking we're going to talk at least some about Wilbur and Beck. But if the writer gives me that pivot, okay, we're doing something different, that relaxes. I
love it. Well, I think we're moving into that potentially productive generative thing. If you want to workshop those couple of sentences you just described in a way that you feel like this is what is needed here, and you're willing to share that with me, and maybe we can iterate that a little bit. I'm not beyond, tweaking this thing, because the whole point of writing this book was to try to bring a bunch of these different camps and tribes together to see that there was some deeper synthesis here. Of course, when you're, I don't know. Yeah. So it can inherently be an alienating thing as well, which I've discovered. And I think the book overall made no one happy, at least in this. Well, that's not true, but it was sufficiently upset all the people who I was trying to actually integrate and bring together. So that's not the goal here, right? And so just, I'd be very happy if there's some language you could come up with, and we could explore that.
Yeah, certainly not my intention going into today, but I think I'm pretty good at that sentence. and also just to set it up as a sort of framework for us, that small aside that contextualizes
Mhm.
work. I want to ask Bruce though, because I've been tracking the body language. He seems to want to be saying something, and we keep going. So
Actually, I'm okay. I'm just responding to work emails that are coming up at the same time as listening to you. Yeah, I've appreciated the conversation, the back and forth, and where you're coming up, where you're arriving at this point. I would say I had some early, criticisms on Brendan's forum, and I meant them in a mild way and didn't mean to open up as much of a can of worms as that dialogue became on the forum. Uh, I generally feel that the framing was done in a way to mostly try to keep various camps of metamodernism happy, several of which are anti-Wilber, and including Wilber would kind of muddy the waters or get in the way of the integration that and the accord among the different metamodernisms that Brendan was wanting to achieve. But one of my criticisms in the forum post was that the telling of the story of Hansi and the origin of his ideas, and to me it was not at all accurate. So I criticized that because it really, Hansi was an integralist who then decided to Shanghai the word metamodernism and put it on an integral project that he was frustrated with. I think Rachel Anderson, she had early dialogues with Daniel Gortz, and they both talked about the excitement of finding the label metamodernism that they might be able to use. And so even though she wants to, she's very, very critical of Wilber and integral, her own model has very many similarities to integral, which she doesn't want to recognize. The whole including of the multiple stages of human cultural development and the post-postmodern wanting to be the inclusion of the best of all of them and all of that. That's so deeply SD and integral, and she doesn't want to acknowledge that. I know that part of it, I've listened to her discussion. She talked about how she traveled back and forth between the US and Europe and gradually began to think more and more about worldviews. Being friends with Daniel, I'm going to go out there and take a chance that she was possibly influenced by integral thinking through Daniel without knowing exactly where that was coming from. But her own model definitely resembles integral in a number of key ways. And we had her on the integral stage a few years ago on our Meta Models series, where we talked about her model and some overlap with integral. And at that point, she wasn't quite as allergic to Wilber, and it all went down okay. In reading Brendan's integration of the multiple metamodernisms, the multiple kind of theoretical tools and strategies that were used, overall, that had a very integral feel to me in terms of the multiple moves and lenses that were used. And I pointed that out. But I think any attempt to be integrative is going to have some overlap in those ways, right? So it's not necessarily directly sourced, but nevertheless, I felt that for me, that was a lesser criticism of the book. I noticed the similarities of the integrative gestures, but for me, it was leaving out the reference to Hansi's actual history that I thought really needed to be better included. And, the whole attempt to have a developmental post-postmodern approach that integrates multiple cultural stages, that is systemic, intersystemic, that is trying to unify some post-metaphysical conceptions of spirituality with modern science. A lot of that is what Brendan is doing under the aegis of metamodernism, and all of that is very similar to an integral project. So I agree that more reference could be there. looking at Storm's book, going through almost most of the key concepts that he's working with are concepts that have also been developed in the integral community, not only by Wilbur, but if you look at the larger diasporic work and in the academic scholastic work, a number of those, in fact, all of those moves are also made by integral thinkers. I don't think he is sourced from that or drawing on that in any way. I don't think that. He does reference Wilbur in his book. He has a footnote pointing to something that Wilbur does that he doesn't really agree with. So he's got some familiarity with Wilbur, but I'm not saying that there's a source there, but to me, going past whatever we're doing in this dialogue, that's actually a fruitful area for exchange and exploration. What has post-metaphysical thinking and integral done that is actually deeply consonant with a number of the things that Storm is proposing? And I think that's a fruitful area to explore. And last little piece here is that integral and metamodernism, they have, some overlapping deep roots and then some, different, more recent branches and origin points. But I would say if you consider metamodernism initially to be tracking changes that were taking place in the culture around the turn of the century and showing up in multiple ways, to me, it's not at all surprising that integral thinking and metamodern thinking are overlapping, at least in the overall expression of a number of different kinds of sensibilities and moves and strategies to deal with problems that were, coming to a head at the end of the last century. So to me, it's not surprising that there's some overlap, and because they're basically coming out of the same problem space, and they don't have exactly the same feels or all of that. So I'm not claiming any kind of identity, but I've had dialogues with Linda and Greg about some of that. They decided not to publish it on their channel, but we did get into a really rich, deep discussion of a lot of areas of overlap and accord. So that's my little download. I promised in this to be mostly a neutral party, so I don't want to continue too much and make Brendan feel ganged up on. I do think Brendan's book is actually a beautifully written book, and it's got a lot of gems in it. So it's not for me, it's just that little piece that I've been highlighting here where I would have wanted things to be handled and attributed a little bit differently. That's that piece.
Yeah, well, just to pick up on that. So I'm curious about, like, the attribution part for me is the serious point. Like, if we're talking about discourses exploring the same space, like what you just talked about, Storm's work developing ideas that are also developed in integral, but they're sourced differently, and there might be some familiarity that Storm has of Wilbur, but it's clear that Storm isn't doing his metamodernism based on Wilbur or in any way. So, but there are claims being made that, like, there's a sourcing issue, there's an academic integrity issue where something is being inaccurately presented, and that to me I take very seriously, right? So here's my note on page 199. The second note in the complexity chapter on Hansi Freinacht, I say, in framing postmodernism as a developmental stage, Freinacht follows a line of thought advanced by American meta-theorist Ken Wilber, whose expansive integral theory aims to synthesize psychological and social development models, among other things. See Ken Wilber 2000. While deeply influenced by Wilbur, though, Freinacht is also critical of his model, as well as some of the uses to which it has been put. His integrative approach to metamodernism reflects a much more secular focus, eschewing the sort of mixing that Wilbur does of psychological and spiritual content. For example, extending the Piagetian stage model of cognitive development with Indian mystics Sri Aurobindo's levels of supermind, In sticking closer to the academic psychological literature, Freinacht aims to avoid such perceived excesses and rehabilitate developmental theories of cultural change. Despite these efforts, however, the proper role of developmental theory remains a point of controversy in metamodern discourse. So I'm not sure. And to be fair, maybe Bruce, you also read it pre because that footnote was added after some conversations, and Josh Leonard, we talked about this, and it seemed like, okay, I got the sense that people really needed a Wilbur acknowledgement, and so I felt like that captures that. But if other people, if Bruce, still you, whoever, if people feel like something is inaccurate here, I just want to know like what that is. The only thing I could think of is that it's, yeah, well, anyway, I'm open to that. I don't. From where I sit, from where I know what I know about the metamodern discourse space, having tracked this since 2014, again, I stand behind this book. I want to be sympathetic to people who are coming at it from different lenses and from different contexts, but I also don't want to just, kowtow to people who have different experiences that maybe don't have the full picture and all this stuff. And so anyway, but yeah, if there's a claim of go on.
So what I would say is that was a perfectly articulate, very short. It was not, it's not, you're not eating your page count. I don't know if you self-published a book, but I did, and the page count gets funny when you have to do your own cover. But that was perfectly articulate, situational, in terms of situating, contextual. It just needs to be in the main text,
in the body of the book. It's funny you mentioned the cover bit. That's exactly why it's a footnote, because if I'd added this to the main body of the text, then it would have messed up the whole pagination thing, and I would have had to redo things. So
and I feel your pain.
But that's not a good excuse if that is a necessary. If moving this from footnote to main body of text will resolve this for people, then
it right there. What you did was you clearly gave Hansi's context. You talked a little bit about what Wilbur has done, and you gave a bit of a critique to help separate the reader from the sort of roads you're going to be going down versus the roads maybe you would go down if you were going to follow Wilbur all the way down. And those kinds of sort of summary kind of context setting words just do so much work for a text. That's my feeling, because if they're in the main part of the text, the reader is definitely going to see it, going to get the acknowledgement. If this is a Wilbur-centric reader, I feel pretty satisfied by that, that Hansi had these critiques of Wilbur and therefore went somewhat on his own way, but was very influenced by Wilbur. Okay, that's absolutely fair. And it gives the reader the opportunity to be like, okay, well, who's this Wilbur guy? And maybe I could check him out. The problem with big things in the footnotes is people, by and large, don't read the footnotes. And there's something about footnoting is, it's parenthetical, but to a heavier degree. It's like saying this is sort of important that we get that in there. And Wilbur is a notorious footnoter, and has sent some of his best materials to the footnotes.
Well, that's what I was thinking. Maybe that's my bias as a footnote reader. Maybe I presume that people place more weight in that content. And certainly as a writer myself, it's not like I'm just writing them for fun, but I totally hear that. So again, if this is a way that we can start to come together on something and clear up some of these issues, then that's an easy, well, relatively, it'll take some time to fix the cover and the pagination and everything, but relatively easy fix. Because again, for me, I've heard a lot of the charges here in some of these reviews and things. Well, there's only one other review that makes, I think, this point, but like there's an intellectual integrity bit there, and I take that very seriously. And so, that's all.
Yeah, and I think because my bias is strong in that direction, I've sat on multiple dissertations, including having to do my own, and I encourage that kind of writing or contextualizing so often. I think that's why my reaction to the book was very strong, because it felt to me that that could be done fairly easily, and then you could be off to the races with, the more specific subject matter. So I left it, I left looking in the, initial part of the book in particular, going, why not just say that thing? It doesn't take much space. It's easy to say, pagination issues aside. So it really surprised me, because otherwise, as I even allude to in my review, if this were just a book about metamodernism, i.e., those things were addressed, it's a very good book, well-written book on. So it's always more frustrating if you feel like, that would be easy for this person to do, rather than this person is over their head, and so forget about it anyway.
Yeah.
So
Well, just
I have
quickly on that point, and then I think Bruce wants to say something. I just wanted to say that again, so yes, totally heard and willing to, do this, because this is the kind of, again, productive thing that is actually, that, yeah. But I do also just want to reiterate that, like, I do think that navigating different people's perceptions based on their previous experience with metamodernism is a factor here. And the fact that I had a previous experience coming through the cultural studies stuff and Dumitrescu and Storm's work and all this stuff, like that to me, in my mind, felt like an end note was an entirely justified, approach to this. And so in hearing some of this feedback, I've been having to balance, like, is that legit, or is that because someone's coming at this from a particular lens that if that were broadened, it wouldn't land that way. But that all aside, all right, well, how about this? If that little end note makes its way into the main body, and you feel like that's a proper, contextualization that needs to happen, and maybe if there's other that sentence or two that you wanted to workshop, maybe you take down that 2-star review, which is tanking my my ratings for the book. Because the last thing I wanted to say too, I guess we got to wrap up soon, is that I think we're all fighting the same battle, so to speak, whatever metaphor you want to use. We're all on the same team in a sense, right? Where I get issues around lineage and I get issues around attribution, but like, it would be a tragedy if people were like, well, they didn't give us what we were owed, and so screw them. Let's, I feel like there's so much that, we're a shared, broader discourse community space for all the reasons we've been talking about. And, I think it's also fine that we have our own maybe different niches or pockets or, manifestations of that. But ultimately, like, there's profound synergy here in the integral and the metamodern community, broadly speaking, that is just obvious. So I would hope that we could lean into that as much as possible, and, rather than sort of get divided and get conquered, but we actually kind of work together to make the world better along the lines that we both see as being important.
And I would say, I mean, one can look at, not really. It's a field that has not yet formed fully as a field. So in other words, there should be, a course at your local college in the next 5 to 10 years, metamodern philosophy. When I went to school, there was ancient philosophy, there was postmodern philosophy. Obviously, these are big survey courses, but there was a name, and then there was an accepted body of literature that you were supposed to read in your modern philosophy course or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, the aesthetic metamodernism, even if they don't like it, integral theory, metamodernism, the way that you are, parsing it out. I think Roy Bhaskar. I mean, there are names and bodies of work that do have a natural, affinity for each other, but this would be some of the meat of it, would be
Hmm.
how did metamodernism come to be? Are we all talking about the same thing or not? What defines it as a metamodern discourse? But I don't think how you can get to that point without at least trying to hash out issues. And
Hmm.
there might, I mean, if we were doing another dialogue, I would be happy to be the apologist for integral theory's sins. You might say to me, integral theory has messed up in these ways. It would be incumbent on me, and I've done it before, to say, okay, well, here's my argument for why it's maybe not so bad.
Hmm.
And those kind of critical, constructive dialogues are just, there's no way around them.
Sure.
Uh,
Well, I'd be happy to come back on the integral stage and have some of those chats too, because I think this was really good. And
fair, fair of you to get to, point out the points of accusation.
or just, I mean, no, anyway, well, I was just going to say, yeah, like just to have meaningful conversations around even the stuff that you brought up mainly in your presentation around, like, Hansi's doing this, but is this legit, and why, and why not, and that sort of thing. I could have those conversations too. And we could, those are important conversations to have as well. Hansi for me he's not the sum total of metamodernism in my view. But anyway, Bruce, were you, I feel like you were going to say something again, or maybe it's those work emails.
It's both. Yeah. Yeah. I've got people asking me why I'm not answering them. So, one, I think, didn't Dumitrescu come along with a discovery after Wilbur? That was
How do you mean?
More recent discovery, I think.
How do you mean?
You discovered Dumitrescu's work more recently than
Oh
Wilbur's.
yeah, because it was really the Vermeulen von Doniker stuff that put the discourse kind of on the map. And then as that cultural studies conversation's been unfolding, then Dumitrescu came up. She's like, "Hey, I've been talking about this since 2007," and so she's been part of that conversation. I was actually really surprised when I did a deep dive into her writing this book, how many connections there were. I was familiar with her work, but when I actually went and read a bunch of her articles, I was like, oh man, so much of this is, deeply integrally, sounds a lot like integral. And again, the fact that she has no conception of the integral model that I know of. She never cites or refers to it explicitly in any way. And yet talks about metamodernism being a kind of integration and all this stuff. I was very surprised by that. So, which is, again, just briefly, if I can nod to the interesting ways in which that also complicates certain ways that people in the cultural studies camp want to tell the story of metamodernism, because there's diversity there, and for whatever reason Dumitrescu's metamodernism can be part of that conversation, but Hansi's can't. It's like there's a strange kind of gatekeeping and policing, and I think a lot of it is also based on certain kinds of academic pedigrees that I find really unfortunate criteria for being able to have certain kinds of conversations, as well as other kinds of concerns. But anyway, it's
Yeah, that's just a little piece I wanted to bring up, because there was the feel, I think the footnote that you just read, which I do like that, and I agree that it would be nice if it was part of the body. I think that came after the discussion that I generated on the forum. So it was a response in part to that, series of conversations. And some of the justification that came up in the dialogue then was that integral doesn't have the same credibility in the academy, and that it was actually a favor to present these ideas in a different way without maybe the baggage of integral growing along with it. And so that it was, to present it in a way that was, framed in metamodern terms without too much problematic and, and academic triggering association with Wilbur. I remember that part of our conversation. And now that I think, you are getting more into the integral academic and think tank side of things with your work with IAM, I'm hoping that you're seeing that there's a lot of people working in this area who are not running off into all the the stuff that concerned Hanzi or Linné in terms of like what's going on with integral thinking. They're just indulging in crazy spiritual ideas or whatever. So there's plus the academic reach of integral thinking, as Mark was showing in his presentation, but as I've done too, it's actually much bigger than anything that's going on with metamodernism, and it's in the academy in a number of ways without being denigrated, and actually making a real impact. And so I think that really, for me, as someone who works in the academic area, I don't like seeing integral sidelined as this weird culty thing when it's actually got so much more going on and so much more complementary work that's been done in a lot of, academic circles and extra Wilberian but still influenced circles. And at that time that your book was published, I remember seeing also in Wikipedia any reference to Wilbur on the Metamodern page was scrubbed. So it just looks like this whole movement of erasing Wilbur from this dialogue, as having any influence or relevance to the whole set of concerns that are being explored. That didn't, from my own background, that didn't sit well. And so that's, I think, what would be a really good gesture is to have it as part of the body, as Mark is saying. It doesn't have to be longer than what that footnote is, in my opinion. But that would, especially, I want to say that your experience with this book is a very Wilberian experience to have, which is pissing off everybody that you're trying to bring together in harmony, right?
Sure.
Wilbur had that happen all the time. And to me, I guess it just goes with the territory, but it's actually, to me, it's a valuable pain point to have to deal with in the long run, but it may involve this back and forth about, and Wilbur has definitely gotten very, very valid criticism from others about how he has incompletely included or he's distorted things in order to make that inclusion. And that criticism of him is well deserved. And there had to be, and there still is, this ongoing negotiation about, okay, we want to make these gestures, but how can we do it in as fair a way as possible, and one that doesn't end up telling false stories in order to achieve our goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I see this whole thing as part of that same kind of generative exchange that hopefully will be fruitful for everybody.
Yeah. I hear all of that, and I would love to have the conversation, which is related to this and was also a big part of Mark's presentation, around the viability of these respective paradigms within our current institutional climate. I think that conversation can be had, should be had, maybe needs to be had in a way that I think can be clear-eyed without being judgmental, or I do think that there are certain arguments that can be made there, and I think that we could potentially come to a deeper understanding, mutual understanding about that, because I think it's important, but I do have slightly different conceptions of what that looks like going forward in terms of institutionalizing a post-postmodernism, and given what these frameworks are and what they're not, how is one or the other better situated to kind of, enter that space. So I think that's a good conversation to have, but it's a little bit certainly beyond the bounds of the next, 2 minutes. So
are you speaking about kind of the relative merits of the model of hierarchical complexity versus the other?
No, I'm speaking more to what you were talking about a minute ago, Mark, of like there should and hopefully will come a time when you can go to your college and there's not just a modern philosophy course or whatever, there's also a blank philosophy course, and whether that's called integral or metamodern or some other different term for a post-postmodernism that is in this space that we're talking about, like trying to achieve that institutional realization is a question about, it's a strategic question as well as other things. It is an intellectual question and all of that, but it is also strategic, it's political, it's rhetorical, it's all these things. And I think we should be, if that's the goal that we're trying to reach, then like we certainly shouldn't be, infighting amongst ourselves and wanting to see something like that happen about what do we call it and who do we, give the credit to. We want to see what's the most likely way that this can actually get instituted. And I think that there are cases to be made for different ways of approaching that project. And I think that Integral folks and Metamodern folks have different things to contribute to that conversation. And so I think that,
Yes.
we should talk about it.
I would agree. I would agree with all of that. Yeah.
Cool. Well, this was great. I feel like not to prematurely close it off. Bruce, also want to respect your time and the work that you've got to do. But I just, from where I'm sitting at this moment, I thought this was a very productive and generative conversation and very mutually respecting. And I'm excited for what comes out of it.
Yeah, I would second that, and I would do the evergreen reminder that having a discussion beats the hell out of typing words on a forum.
Sure.
One is truly superior. So thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Bruce. This was very enjoyable, and I also felt was generative, and I'm coming out with a better understanding of, I think, a couple of things, and not just what I wanted to get across per se. So yes.
Awesome.
Great. Well, thank you both. Glad to have you on. The Integral Stage has been dormant for the last few weeks, so this will prick people up probably the beginning of next week. So thank you both. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Thank you.